August 9th, Franz Jagerstatter.
Sometimes it's better to lose your head than to lose your integrity. In 1938, German troops marched into Austria, took over, and it legally became part of the Third Reich. They held a vote to determine whether Austria would adopt the Nazi leadership, and more than 99% of the population approved. The church, having seen what happened to clergy who disagreed with the Germans, took the position that it was the duty of all Austrians to obey legitimate authorities. And the entire village of St. Radegund voted in favor of the Nazis, except for one man. Franz Jagerstatter believed that Christianity and Nazism were completely incompatible, like oil and water, or good and evil. The thought of believing your country would take the place of believing in God was absurd. In about 5 years, he was drafted, but he refused to enter the war and fight for Hitler. Franz swore that it was impossible to be a good Catholic and a true Nazi. His bishop, who believed as Franz did, but didn't want to face the consequences, confronted Franz and said it was not his place to decide whether the war was righteous or unrighteous, and he told Franz that his duty was to serve. Franz wrote to the bishop, "If the church stays silent in the face of what is happening, what difference would it make if no church were ever opened again? But if Franz remained silent and turned his back on God, that would make a huge difference. All the difference for eternity. The day of consequence was approaching." First, Franz offered to serve as a medic and to care for fallen soldiers, but the offer was denied. So Franz refused to take the oath to Hitler and declared himself as a conscientious objector. His line in the sand had been drawn, and he wouldn't cross it. German military authorities immediately arrested Franz and imprisoned him in the same prison that was holding Dietrich Bonhoeffer. While awaiting trial, Franz learned that 1 year earlier, an Austrian priest by the name of Franz Reinisch had been a conscientious objector on the same grounds and was executed. Franz was deeply impacted by this, but he realized he could change nothing in world affairs. Nonetheless, he wanted to at least be a sign that not everyone would let themselves be carried away with the tide. 8 months later, he was found guilty of undermining military morale and was executed by guillotine. This was not the first time something like this had happened. In the book of Acts, we read a similar account when the apostles stood up to the governing authorities of their day. Acts 5:25 through 29 says this, "And someone came and told them, 'Look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people.' Then the captain with the officers went and brought them, but not by force, for they were afraid of being stoned by the people. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council. And the high priest questioned them, saying, 'We strictly charge you not to teach in this name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us.' But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" Are there times when you are challenged to stand for God in the face of evil? Sometimes it's better to lose your head than to lose your integrity.
Well, hey man, Eric Bloom here, one of the pastors at Landing Place Church in Commerce City, Colorado. August 9th today, Franz Jagerstatter. I had never heard of Franz, his story. Of course, like many, I've heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but Franz's story was new to me and had no idea that he was a contemporary of the same time. Like many of these videos, these stories of inspiring men throughout history, one of the common feelings that I can have inside of myself as a man is shame. And in this context, it's the shame that comes from comparison. So like I look at my contemporary context where I'm at now, and I'm not facing Nazi oppression. I'm not at a crossroads of making a defense of my faith in the very real presence of evil that could cost me my life. But then I hear a story like Franz's, and it's easy for me to kind of feel like, oh man, do I have the same kind of stuff inside of me to make a decision like that? Maybe you feel that too, of just like you're watching these stories and you're inspired, but at one sense you're like, man, do I have what it takes? And then shame starts to set in. You start to compare yourself to these men, and that's one of the insidious ways that the enemy just kind of lurks around to just bring about these kind of ideas in us, and actually to lead us away from our faith being bolstered. And as I was just kind of processing my own feelings and just kind of like praying with the Lord, one of the things that came to my mind was that God gives us grace for the things that we face. Like, God gives us grace for today. He has not given us his grace for tomorrow. It's not until we get to tomorrow that he will give us grace for tomorrow. And so in these instances, God has given all of these men throughout history grace to face whatever is before them. And with Franz Jagerstatter, God gave him powerful grace to be, as the video says, a conscientious objector. And so I just want to encourage you men today to lean into God's grace, which is sufficient for you today. And that whatever he is calling you to do today, whether you're in a context where you are actively being a conscientious objector yourself, or it's just kind of a normal day. But regardless, is that God gives us grace for today. He doesn't give us grace for the what ifs that may or may not happen in the future, but his grace is powerful for us today. So men, how can you lean into God's powerful grace today?